Welcome to our Cowboys block. I'm joined with a very special guest here on the 214 Sports Show ahead of the draft in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I'm joined with the one, the only Tommy Yarrish. Tommy, how you doing?
Doing great, Joe. Always good to talk to you. You've been, such a good friend and supporter of mine since our time together at Texas, and being able to, watch you grow and watch the show grow has been really fun, man. I'm super excited for you, and I'm excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
And for sure, it's an honor and privilege for you to even join this podcast. Um, Been one of my biggest mentors, of course, and the respect is mutual. Of course, we have him on here as the Cowboys reporter here. Tommy is working for the Dallas Cowboys media department. And before we get into the content for this little brief block, Tommy, tell us about yourself, your journey through broadcast journalism, journalism as a whole, as a student, and then eventually leading to the Dallas Cowboys.
Sure. So I started out as I grew up as just another kid from Chicago. Spent the first 13 years there, and moved down to Texas and Houston area. Went to Bridgeland High School in Cypress, so I got pretty acclimated to, how big of a deal football was down here at every single level. It wasn't like that as much up north. Obviously, everybody loves the Bears, but it is a little bit different in Texas, and so I learned pretty quickly about that. Always wanted to be on the media side of things. Once I figured out that I was no good at any sports, and so I jumped right into that right away in high school, covering some Texas high school sports, and continued that track in college and started covering Texas during my time at Texas, my last 2 years there, and then through some very great people around me and a lot of luck and what would like to think is a little bit of hard work too. Was able to land this job with the Cowboys. Been here about I think we're going on 8 months or so now, maybe a little bit less than that, but it's been a lot of fun and I've really enjoyed it. But always look forward to coming back and talking to you guys because you guys were huge for me, and a lot of my close friends are still back there, and always willing to do whatever I can for you guys.
Yeah, and then for those who don't realize, of course, me and TJ have mentioned it many times in the podcast. We know each other as students at the University of Texas, but even deeper, we've all worked in the sports organization, a broadcasting organization for student television at UT called Texas Student Television in their sports wing. That's where we met so many mentors and guys that passed on here like Adam Ogburn, like Carter Yates, who now works for Dave Campbell's Texan Live, and of course Tommy here joined with us in the call and now works for the Dallas Cowboys. Again, thank you for joining us, Tommy. Let's dive in really quick for this draft. An overall view, looking at 1 and 2 in the draft. Obviously, we kind of have a kind of a good gist of who's going there for now, whether it be Cam Ward, Travis Hunter. It's pretty predictable who's going there, whether it be Ward or the Heisman winner. Who do you think the New York Giants can or will select at number 3, however?
Yeah, I think 1, 2, 3 is pretty set in this draft, Joe. I think it's Cam Ward 1 to the Titans. I think it's Travis Hunter 2 to the Browns, and I think it's Abdul Carter at 3 to the Giants, the edge rusher from Penn State. There was some Shador buzz out there, and the Giants did a lot of their homework on Sure Sanders. But you just look at the situation that New York is in. They bring in two quarterbacks in free agency and guys that are kind of in a shortened window, and it's in a regime really that I feel like is in a shortened window in terms of, hey, they've got to nail these picks in this draft because a lot of these guys' jobs are on the line. And so if one of the top two consensus overall players in this class is on the table for you there at number 3, I think you got to walk that card in. There's quarterbacks they can take in the second round. I mean, if Shador Sanders is a guy they like and they don't take him at 3, that might be a guy who's able to drop to them at 34. So I think at 3, Abdul Carter is the absolute pick, and then it'll be interesting to see what they do at 34 because that's going to answer the question of, okay, do the Giants feel good about going into this season with Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston as their quarterback room, or are they going to bank on a guy in this year's draft? Because a little bit too of it, I think, Joe, and I know it's kind of counterintuitive to what I said about the organization and how they are in terms of, hey, some of these guys might be picking for their jobs here in this draft. You look at next year's quarterback class and you say, okay, maybe if we don't get the season we want to, we can grab our guy next year in a Garrett Nussmeier or in a Cade Klubnik if those guys decide to enter the draft. So It's an interesting case study for sure because you also wonder, okay, is it Shador Sanders or Jackson Dart or Jalen Milroe going to beat out a Jameis Winston or Russell Wilson early on, or are we going to have to sit and let them develop? So interesting case for the Giants, but to go back to answering your initial question, I think it's Abdul Carter from Penn State, the edge rusher at number three.
Yeah, and I don't know if this was rage bait on my Twitter timeline, but I saw someone giving a profile about Abdul Carter. Might have been a reach here, but they were saying his ceiling is Lawrence Taylor, his floor is Micah Parsons. Now, I don't know about that, but I can see what they're trying to do with that profile because he's obviously a pretty big guy, kind of not exactly the most speedy edge rusher, but he knows how to, bend around the tackles and get home for a sack. And for a Giants defense that was pretty underrated last season, of course, they didn't have Wink Martindale anymore, who went on to the Michigan Wolverines to replace the fallen Harbaugh regime as he moved on to the LA Chargers. It's a defense that, could be even better if they get an Abdul Carter. And as division rival of the Dallas Cowboys, adding Russell Wilson, who had a little bit of a career resurgence last year, still left a few Steelers fans underwhelming. It might be a very high pressure situation for this Giants team, especially for Brian Dable, who is surprisingly being brought back again. I honestly didn't think he would be brought back, but he is definitely on the hot seat in my opinion. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree, and that's why I think it goes back to my point of saying, hey, a lot of these guys are coaching for their jobs and picking for their jobs in terms of the GM and the front office staff. Is you gotta make some of these roster additions come to fruition. You look at their top to bottom, they've got some really good players on this roster. I mean, you look at how good Malik Neighbors was for them, their first round pick last year. Dexter Lawrence is one of the best defensive tackles at the one tech spot in the entire league. So they've got the young talent there, and they've with excuse me, with adding Abdul Carter, they're really beefing up their pass rush, and that's something that was kind of lackluster a bit at times. And you got Brian Burns coming back. They made a deal for him, and so that's you got two really solid edge rushers there in Burns and Carter and Lawrence in the middle. I mean, that's a pretty good defensive line, especially when you think about the NFC East in terms of the teams and how well they bolstered up on the offensive line. I mean, you look at Philadelphia, they had one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, and they go on and win a Super Bowl because of it. Conversely, they had one of the best defensive lines in the NFL, and that was a big reason why they went to the Super Bowl and won the Super Bowl. So, the line of scrimmage is such an important part of the game of football, regardless of which level you play at. And I think that an Abdul Carter pick would certainly be a step in the right direction.
Number 9 in team sacks for the New York Giants last season with 45. Kind of slowed down a little bit towards the end of the season, but still an overall underrated defense. Moving on to, you mentioned the word regime a few minutes ago. It's a new regime for the Dallas Cowboys. Brian Schottenheimer, the new head coach for America's team. Clayton Adams, the new OC. A whole new regime from top to bottom on this coaching staff. And it's going to be his first draft, Brian Schottenheimer. Do you think there's pressure on him to hit this draft out of the park, or is there a little bit of leeway because it is his first?
I think there's always going to be pressure, especially when you hire a guy like Brian Schottenheimer who has so much to prove because he's never been a head coach in the NFL. He was not a candidate elsewhere in terms of interview processes for other teams for their head coaching vacancies. And this is a guy that, I mean, even Jerry Jones in an introductory press conference said, yeah, this is a risky hire. But this is a risky pick. And, I think that Brian Schottenheimer, you got to give him a lot of credit because he has absolutely hit the ground running. And I think that, you know, he's we've talked about it a lot about him because of his profile and his makeup, but we're still undervaluing just how much that 20 plus years of experience of being in the league and, having his dad, Marty Schottenheimer, who's a Hall of Fame head coach, in his life has kind of prepared him for this moment because this has been a long time coming for Brian Schottenheimer. And now he's getting his shot and he's not wasting any time. He hit the ground running. They went and got a heck of a staff. I mean, from top to bottom is a really impressive staff, I feel like. And I think it kind of exceeded my expectations of what the team was going to gather and put around him. I mean, you bring back Matty Flus, who wasn't a great head coach in Chicago, but he was a really good defensive play caller. And, the guys on his staff, you think about the defensive backs coach who developed some of the best DBs in the league in terms of guys like Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon and Tyreek Stevenson sometimes. So it's a good staff. And on the offensive side of the ball, you've got a good mix of guys who want to emphasize the run game, and a Clayton Adams is the offensive coordinator, and some college guys who can bring you some fresh new juice to how you look at things, and Junior Adams and Connor Riley. So you credit Brian Schottenheimer for doing that, and really leaning on the scouting department and Will McClay's group in terms of, hey, they've structured it to where Will McClay and his scouting department are cooking up their reports on these guys. They're picking the coaches' brains in terms of what are the players they want. They show them, these guys, and here's how they can help you. Here's why they can help you, and then ultimately it's kind of up to the group to make a collective decision. So I know they got off to a little bit of a late start in terms of the draft evaluation process because they were still building and rounding out their staff. But, I think Brian Schottenheimer has placed a lot of his trust in Will McClay and his scouting team to be able to help them find what they're looking for. And, I think they're looking for physical players. I think they're looking for players that that love football. That was a big emphasis in their pre-draft press conference today. Is Brian Schottenheimer and Will McClay want guys who love football and who want to get better. And so obviously that kind of sounds like a given, but there have been a lot of players around the league that, they get to the NFL level and they don't really treat it like a job. And you see some high round picks kind of start to fluster in their careers. So there's a lot of needs on this team. And this is a big draft for the Cowboys, and it's everything that Brian Schottenheimer does is going to be put under a microscope just because of the nature of his situation that he's in. But I really do think that he's gotten off to a good start, and now we'll see what he can do with these players that he picks.
I
And it's
completely
not really
agree.
him
Yeah.
picking; it's a complete
Yeah,
decision. So if
exactly.
a pick doesn't turn out, it's not necessarily falling all on Brian Schottenheimer, right?
Sure, sure.
Now, folks might discuss it that way because he's an easy scapegoat because of
Right.
all the things we just mentioned. But this is a collective decision, and there obviously he's got to do his part and develop the guys that get in there. If the Cowboys want to call themselves a draft and develop franchise, and they've got to continue to do that, which I think they have a good track record of. But now it's his turn, and he's got to prove that he can do it.
Well, looking back on positional needs, as you were saying, I mean, the 2021 season for the Dallas Cowboys, obviously a lot of gaudy stats, especially in the receiving core. CeeDee Lamb emerging along with Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, and a great receiving core as a whole. Since then, not so great, of course, for the trade of Amari Cooper that a lot of Cowboys fans may regret, of course, with getting only a fifth round pick. And since then, CeeDee Lamb has been obviously the clear number one for the Cowboys. And this receiving core cannot get any separation for the most part. One of the worst in the league in getting separation because these teams hound for CeeDee Lamb, the clear number one. Do you think for pick number 12, which the Cowboys have in the first round, it's a given to go for receiver, say getting a Matthew Golden from the Texas Longhorns, or maybe a Tetaroa McMillan from Arizona if he drops that far? Is it pretty much set to have a high level receiver, or could you rely in the second round as well?
I don't think it's a given at all that they go wide receiver at 12. I think it's high on their list of options, but I don't think it is a guarantee at all that like that. I know some folks are saying, hey, okay, it's going to be McMillan or Matthew Golden. I don't think that's the case, and we kind of talked about it on our draft show today. Is if McMillan is off the board, which I think he will be, and Golden is still on the board there for you at 12, are there going to be guys on their board overall who are higher than Matthew Golden? And I think there will be. I've got Golden as my third receiver. I've got Luther Burden from Missouri ahead of him. I think for the Cowboys, Golden fits better than Burden does, but that doesn't. I think Burden is the better prospect. Uh, but how does their board overall stack up, and are they going to trust their board in that process? Are they going to lean on their board? I thought Stephen Jones had an interesting point earlier today in the pre-draft presser when he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not directly quoting him, just if we obviously won't want to take, the best player available, but if there are guys, who are similarly graded, and we've got similar grades on, and one of them is at a position of need, and one of them is at a spot where we feel pretty good at, then we might defer from the board a little bit and go for the guy that we need at a position that we feel like there's a vacancy in. And that's not to say they're going to go a full round grade down. So they're not going to take a third round grade in the second or anything of that if there's second round picks all over the board. But it's something where, if they've got Burden and Golden as first round grades, for example, and Golden is not that far off from Burden, do you feel like he's a better fit in your offense with what he's able to do? That's the question that, the Cowboys are going to have to answer. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion when the clock rolls around at 12. If McMillan is off the board and Golden is still there, you think about some of the other guys that there's been some buzz around, and Michael Williams, the edge rusher from Georgia, Will Johnson, the corner from Michigan, Emeka Egbuka, the wide receiver from Ohio State, is another guy that I feel like they really like. So there's Walter Nolan, the defensive tackle from Ole Miss, the last couple of days has seemingly generated some buzz. So, are all those guys potential possibilities at the number 12 overall pick? It's a really interesting place to be at for the Cowboys in this draft, just because, from 10 to 40, I don't think the players are all that far apart in terms of skill and,
Sure.
And grade overall. It's not very, this class is full of depth, but in terms of guys who, could develop into starters or be depth pieces, not necessarily these superstar guys. And not that there's, always going to be 25 first round grades in every class, but it feels like you've got your top guys and there's a significant drop off in this group. So how much do they value that? And honestly, I think at 12, if they can trade back, they'd love to do that. I think that getting as much draft capital as they can in this class is a goal of theirs. But at the end of the day, you got to have two to tango, and I don't know how many tango partners you're going to find this year.
Well, I mean, you look at also this offensive line. I don't think offensive line is going to be the pick for first round at all. I was a little bit surprised going for Tyler Guyton last year, but it ended up being a pick that I'm kind of satisfied with. There's a lot of untapped potential there, in my opinion. Not the best rookie season, but he's a lengthy guy. He has good arms. He has quick feet that can be worked on, and so I do think there's untapped potential there. So looking at the offensive line here, Zach Martin finally calling it a career. We knew that day was eventually going to come, and facing a lot more injuries than we've accustomed to for Zach Martin. Do you think that Robert Jones is enough at right guard for this offensive line, or do they hound it again, possibly in the mid rounds to get more beefed up at the offensive line?
Right now, it's hard to tell with Robert Jones, just because we haven't seen him practice or anything like that, and we don't know where he's at. Based on what we know about him for coming in, I feel like you can find a better option out there. That's not to say that Robert Jones can't start for it. He started all the games last year for Miami, but I think you can find a player that is better for you in this draft. Now the question there is how early. How early do they find him, or do you have a guy already in the room that you feel like can be better? Is Brock Hoffman that guy? Is Brock Hoffman a guy who can beat Robert Jones out and start all 17 games for you? Offensive line is another one of those positions that, going back to the last question, getting addressed, that's something that's very possible that the Cowboys use a premium pick on. I don't think you can build enough depth in that room, and I don't think they do either. So, they've used two out of their last three first round picks on an offensive lineman. I don't think they'll do so at 12, unless you're looking at a situation where Armand Membu from Mizzou or Will Campbell from LSU falls. I think that would change things a little bit. But, maybe in the second round, a guy like Donovan Jackson from Ohio State, if he's there for you at 44, I think that would bring up an interesting discussion. Tate Ratledge from Georgia might be a guy who falls because of the injury. Marcus Mbao from Purdue. Just, throwing names at the wall there. But it's certainly a position that I feel like the Cowboys will draft. I think an offensive lineman absolutely is going to be drafted. I think they've done so in the last 7 drafts. They've picked an offensive lineman. It's just kind of a matter of where. But for that right guard spot specifically, and this isn't a knock on Robert Jones or saying he's a bad player, but I just feel like there are better players that you can try to get out there for you. this season. And if it ends up being Robert Jones, then you hope that he can continue to play all 17 games, and you're not going to fill Zach Martin's shoes. So, nobody's going to step in there and be Zach Martin, but just try to be a better unit and overall, work on a run scheme that can help open things up. And I think for the entire offensive line, with the hiring of Clayton Adams and bringing in Connor Riley, I think that group as a whole is going to be a lot better this year. The Cowboys are investing a lot in this
Mhm.
offensive line. Brian Schottenheimer is investing a lot in the offensive line. And in the past, when the Cowboys have had their best teams, it's been because their offensive line has been so good. So I think Schott is taking the right approach in that aspect. I think the coaching that they're going to get is going to be something that helps turn this around. And that's going to benefit guys like Tyler Guyton and Terrence Steele to continue to turn that corner. And so now the question is, who's that fifth guy that you bring in there, that right guard spot to really round this whole thing out?
And you hit the nail right in the head. Classic run offense is the Cowboys' model for their successful seasons. Bring in now a Javonte Williams from the Denver Broncos, Miles Sanders, Deuce Vaughn still with the team along with Malik Davis. We'll see how they fare closer to training camp. But moving on to the other side of the ball here, one of my favorite gets for this Cowboys team, new DC, Matt Eberflus. Of course, Dan Quinn is no longer the DC after becoming the head coach of the Washington Commanders 2 seasons ago, last season, leading them to the NFC Championship. And now the Cowboys have brought in a Kenneth Murray Jr. They get Dante Fowler back after a career season, 11 and a half sacks. We saw them also trade for Kyrie Elam from the Buffalo Bills. And this team is also, re-signed Osa Digizua, even got Solomon Thomas, a former uh, top 10 pick from the Niners. When you look at this defense, do you think the needs more, it goes more to secondary and cornerback, or do you think it's more about beefing up the linebackers later on in the rounds?
Well, right now I feel like they've only got one starting corner, and that's Deron Bland, just because Trayvon Diggs is injured.
Right.
Um, you've got what does Kyrie Elam look like, right? Is a fresh start going to benefit him? Because if it's the Kyrie Elam that we saw against the Chiefs, he was kind of getting picked on a little bit, and I
Hmm.
feel like a fresh start's going to really benefit him. I think this is a good secondary staff for him to develop under, and it's a friendly scheme for defensive backs because Matt, if you're good in zone coverage, and Matt Eberflus is a big zone coverage guy, there's going to be a lot of that. So is Kyrie Elam ready for that shift, and is he ready to kind of slide into that system? But aside from Deron Bland, who do you really feel confident about putting out there? And who do you put in the slot to replace Jordan Lewis? So I think that's a big spot, and I think the first 3 rounds you're absolutely going to see the Cowboys. Not absolutely, I would think that you see the Cowboys address the cornerback position in the first 3 rounds, just because there's so much uncertainty there. I think you probably look more towards 44 for that pick. One guy I really like is Savon Rebel, the
Hmm.
corner from East Carolina. I know that the gag is the Cowboys taking an injured guy in the second round all the time. This is a guy who very easily could be the highest ranked corner in the class had he stayed healthy. 6'1", 202, good length. The Cowboys love their long corners in terms of tall guys who can move really well for their size, long arms, and Rebel fits that profile perfectly. You got Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Noah Williams from Cal is a guy, Azariah Thomas, Wanye Thomas's brother from Florida State. So there are guys in the first 3 rounds of this draft that you can probably feel pretty good about trotting out there on day one. Those are just a couple of the names listed, but I think looking at the two, I think cornerback is your bigger need, but at the same time, defensive tackle is not far behind. They've only got 5 on the roster right now. You cannot go into next season with 5 defensive tackles on your roster. You've got to beef up that offensive line, and so that's that's going to be paramount or excuse me, the defensive line. So I think they need a big one tech to pair alongside Oso Digizua. Mozzie Smith obviously is got to continue to take strides in the right directions. I think he took a step in the right direction this past season. Still not to the level where it needs to be for him, but I think he took a step in the right direction. I know Matt Eberflus and this defensive staff are really excited about getting to work with Mozzie Smith. Maybe they can help him kind of turn that corner in year three. That would be huge. But still, you want to find that big body defensive tackle that can close those gaps for you in the middle. Is it a is there a situation where Kenneth Grant from Michigan drops to the second at 44? Alfred Collins from Texas, could he be there in the second or third round? Um, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon, all guys to kind of keep an eye on that would kind of fit that bill in terms of big bodies that plug up the middle of the defensive line and stop the run, something that the Cowboys have struggled to do at times.
And speaking of cornerback, news came out earlier Tuesday that former Defensive Player of the Year Stephon Gilmore was visiting the team in Frisco. And do with that what you will, but he's 34 years old, was with the Cowboys 2 seasons ago, left on a sour note after getting bounced by the Green Bay Packers in a game that was not even close at Jerry World. But could that be a signing you think that is, there for the Cowboys and defense that could even help them if he is signed at all?
Well, my understanding, based on several conversations, was that it wasn't a free agent visit that was submitted to the league, so it wasn't any sort of the Cowboys inquiring about him or anything like that. I think it was just as simple as he may have been in the area and he was passing through. Who knows? It was funny because we were in the pre-draft press conference. We look out the window and there he is walking by.
Just
And everybody kind of
walking
looks
by.
around at each other like, is like, is that, did we really just see that? Like, that was
That's
Stephon
Stephon
Gilmore.
Gilmore.
But with the need at corner, that's a guy where he's familiar with, the Cowboys organization. He's familiar with, you know, you can't say he's familiar with the scheme because he played for a different defensive coordinator,
Right.
but he knows what it's like to play alongside Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland. He knows what he needs to do. He's been in the NFL for a long time, and he's been great in the NFL for a long time. So it's a name that makes a lot of sense, but we'll see what goes on here in terms of whether or not that's a sign that they make. And you think they might also make it after the draft too, and make a lot of these decisions after the draft, just because you think about the comp pick formula, and do they don't want to give up more comp picks to other teams, so does it work in their favor to make those additions after the draft?
All right, Tommy, I think that'll do it for me. Where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, you can go ahead and find me at Tommy underscore Yarrish on Twitter and X. That's where I'm primarily at, and all of our work was over at DallasCowboys.com. We've got a great team over there. We cover the team year long. It's a really cool site. I think we do a really good job. I've got a lot of great teammates over there, and it's been a lot of fun working with them.
All right, man. Thank you so much for joining us. Seriously, like I was just honored that you joined our podcast again. It's just an honor to have you on here and just watching you grow, man. You keep on working hard, bro. You're doing an awesome job for the Dallas Cowboys.
Thanks, man. Anything for you guys, and I appreciate y'all's support. And anytime you want me back, just say the word. It's my honor.
All right, thank you. Tommy Yarrish of the Dallas Cowboys.